In the mist-veiled village of Ambleside, where every smile hides a judgment, Harriet Moore arrives seeking peace and finds a ballroom burning with whispers. At every assembly, the widowed Marquess of Ravensmere stands by the wall, silent as morning, watching the woman who never sees him, until one glance changes everything. But a single look can become a scandal, and a secret buried in grief can rise like a storm. Will Harriet choose safety in the light or truth in the shadows? Stay with us, because tonight love dares to step out of silence. Subscribe to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Ambleside, the Lake District, England. 1817. The wind carried the scent of rain and peat across the valley as Harriet Moore walked down the narrow cobbled street that led to her late aunt's cottage. The Lake District was as she remembered it, solemn, beautiful, and slightly cruel in its stillness. The air smelled of damp stone, and the mist rolled from the fells like a curtain drawn by invisible hands. Every sound seemed amplified in that silence. The echo of hooves, the rustle of her wool cloak, the tremor of her own breath. She had returned after 6 long years away, not as a young woman filled with dreams, but as one who had learned that love and loss often shared the same breath. The villagers recognized her immediately. They greeted her with polite smiles and curious eyes, whispering behind gloved hands. She knew what they were thinking. Why had she come back? And more importantly, had she come alone? The small stone cottage awaited her on the hill, with ivy curling around the doorway and a chimney that still remembered the smell of her aunt's tea. Inside, everything was unchanged. The faded floral curtains, the wooden table by the hearth, the quiet. It was as if time itself had been waiting for her to arrive and breathe life back into its rooms. As she unpacked her trunk, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the mantel. Her face had grown more defined, her eyes deeper, touched by the kind of sadness that doesn't destroy but refines. Her hair, a deep chestnut brown, was twisted into a modest chignon beneath her bonnet, a few strands escaping to soften her features. She removed her gloves slowly, her fingers slender and pale against the dark fabric of her gown. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit still and feel the weight of her solitude. That Sunday, she attended church as duty required. The pews were filled with familiar faces, older now, but still bound by the rhythm of gossip and propriety. As the rector began his sermon, Harriet's gaze drifted until it met someone else's. At the far end of the church, standing apart from the congregation, was a tall man dressed in black. He did not look at the rector, nor at anyone in particular. His eyes were lowered at first, thoughtful, then raised, steady, meeting hers across the distance with disarming calm. It was not boldness that made her heart quicken. It was the quiet certainty in his gaze, as though he had been waiting for her without knowing it. When the service ended, Harriet tried not to look for him again. But she saw him outside, near the gate, offering a polite nod to the rector's wife, then turning away. The villagers parted as he passed, lowering their voices. His name drifted through their murmurs like an echo. Lord Ravensmere. That evening, she heard the rest. He was a widower, a man who rarely spoke, who came to the assemblies but never danced. His estate, Ravensmere Hall, stood beyond the woods, overlooking the lake like a watchful shadow. They said he had loved his wife dearly, that her death had left him hollow. Some whispered of mystery, of guilt, of something unspeakable. Harriet dismissed the gossip, yet his image lingered, as if carved into the mist. A week later, an invitation arrived for the winter assembly at the inn's ballroom, a tradition the village clung to with fervor. Harriet hesitated. She had no interest in flirtations or social pretense, but her neighbors would not tolerate another absence. So, she went. The ballroom glowed with candlelight, its air sweet with the scent of wax and perfume. Muslin gowns brushed past her, laughter fluttered like ribbons. Harriet stood near the edge of the room, her heart steady, her eyes quiet. And then she saw him. James Blackwood, Marquess of Ravensmere, stood by the far wall, hands clasped behind his back, his dark attire absorbing the golden light around him. He did not move, did not join the dance, but observed, calmly, almost mournfully. And when Harriet stepped onto the floor, her pale gown catching the light like morning mist, she felt the weight of his gaze upon her. She danced out of obligation, not joy. Her partner, a courteous clerk, spoke of trade and roads, of horses and rain. She nodded politely, but her mind wandered. Each turn of the dance carried her closer to the corner where the Marquess stood, silent and still. When the music paused, she found herself facing him for an instant. His expression did not change, yet there was something in his eyes, a recognition, faint and uncertain, like the first reflection of dawn on the water. Later, as the guests lingered, Harriet slipped out onto the terrace for air. The night was sharp and silver, the lake below reflecting the candlelight from the windows. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders, breathing in the cold. "Miss Moore," a deep voice said behind her. She turned, startled. He stood a few steps away, his presence almost too large for the quiet space between them. His voice was steady, low, carrying warmth beneath restraint. "I hope I did not frighten you," he said. "You looked as though you needed a moment away from the noise." "You did not frighten me, my lord," she replied softly, "though I confess I did not expect company here." He glanced toward the ballroom. "Nor did I. Yet here we are, both seeking the same silence." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the ribbons of her shawl. Harriet met his gaze fully then, and what she saw made her breath falter, a sorrow that had not dimmed him, but deepened him. "You are not fond of dancing?" she asked quietly. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Once, perhaps. Not anymore. The music has changed, or maybe I have." His words settled between them like a secret. Harriet felt the ache behind them, an ache she understood too well. "Some dances," she murmured, "are not meant to be taken with the feet." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a fleeting instant she felt the world pause. It was not desire that passed between them, but recognition, a meeting of two souls who had long forgotten what it meant to be seen. A burst of laughter from the ballroom broke the spell. He inclined his head, stepping back. "Good evening, Miss Moore." She wanted to answer, to thank him for that moment of honesty, but her voice refused to form words. He turned and walked away, his figure dissolving into the mist, like a shadow returning to its home. Harriet remained there long after he left, her heart restless, her eyes fixed on the reflection of the lights trembling on the surface of the lake. It was then she understood that something had shifted, not in the night, but within her. She had come back to Ambleside seeking peace, and instead found a gaze that promised storms. And far away, within the grand solitude of Ravensmere Hall, James Blackwood stood by the window of his study, staring at the same lake. His hand rested against the glass, his eyes dark and unblinking. He had seen hundreds of faces at those endless assemblies, but only one had made the silence feel alive again. The next morning arrived with a thin veil of mist hanging over Ambleside, softening the edges of the world. The bells from St. Mary's Church tolled faintly in the distance, their echoes stretching over the lake like threads of silver. Inside her cottage, Harriet Moore sat by the window, the light diffused and pale across her writing desk. Her tea had long gone cold, and before her lay a book of poetry that did not belong to her. It had been lent to her the night before by Mrs. Pennington, the rector's wife, a volume of Wordsworth and Coleridge that the entire village seemed to admire but few truly read. As Harriet turned the fragile pages, her eye caught something unusual, a faint pencil line in the margin drawn beside a stanza about grief. The verse spoke of a heart that remembers even when it dares not feel. Next to it, in elegant, restrained handwriting, someone had written, "Perhaps remembering is the only way to survive." And she touched the words with her fingertips as if they might still be warm from the hand that wrote them. There was no signature, but the script was unmistakably masculine, steady, deliberate, and oddly intimate. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, her pulse unsteady. It was foolish, she told herself, to let a few words affect her so deeply. And yet, they did. Outside, the mist was lifting. The faint outlines of cottages and fields emerged like memories returning from sleep. Harriet wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out, her boots crunching lightly over the damp path. The air carried the scent of moss and peat, the sound of distant sheep bells, the quiet rhythm of a village beginning its day. As she reached the main street, she caught sight of Mrs. Pennington herself, round, rosy-cheeked, and radiating the self-importance of a woman who managed everyone else's propriety. "My dear Miss Moore," she called cheerfully, "I hope you enjoyed the reading. Such moral elevation in those poems, do you not think?" "They are beautiful," Harriet replied with a polite smile. "Some verses seem to speak directly to the heart." Mrs. Pennington nodded, her bonnet trembling with enthusiasm. "Indeed. Though I must say the book has passed through many hands in this parish. Why, even Lord Ravensmere himself borrowed it once. He has a taste for melancholy, or so I'm told." Harriet's heart gave a small, involuntary jolt. "Lord Ravensmere?" Yes. Mrs. Pennington went on, oblivious. "He returned it some months ago. Such a solemn man, poor creature, but kind. Always donates to the church, though he rarely speaks. Quite tragic, isn't it?" Harriet murmured a vague assent and continued her walk, but her mind was no longer in the present. The handwriting in the margin returned to her like a whisper she could not silence. The Marquis of Ravensmere, James Blackwood. Could it be his? By afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds, gilding the hills in pale gold. Harriet walked to the edge of the lake, where the wind stirred the reeds. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, half shattered, both beautiful and uncertain. She sat on a rock near the shore, the book open again in her lap. She read aloud in a low voice, "To love that well which thou must leave ere long." The sound of her own voice startled her. She had spoken softly, but the air seemed to carry the words farther than she intended. A quiet voice answered behind her, "That line never loses its power, does it?" She turned. James Blackwood stood a few steps away, dressed in a dark coat, his gloved hands clasped loosely behind him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those calm, steady grey eyes, were fixed on her with quiet recognition. "My lord," she began, rising to her feet. "I did not expect company." He inclined his head. "Forgive me. I often walk here when the house becomes too silent. I had not realized the path led to your refuge." The word refuge made her heart stir. "It is a peaceful place," she said softly. Or it was. A faint smile touched his lips. "Then I should go before I disturb it further." But he did not move. The silence between them was not awkward. It was delicate, charged, as if one breath too loud might break it. Harriet looked down at the book in her hands, then lifted it slightly. "Mrs. Pennington lent me this," she said. There was a note in the margin, a line about remembering. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Was it yours?" He did not look surprised. Instead, a shadow of vulnerability crossed his features, quickly hidden. "Yes," he said quietly. "I had forgotten the book had travelled so far. I wrote it years ago." Harriet felt an inexplicable tenderness toward that admission. "It is a beautiful thought," she murmured. "Sad, but beautiful." He glanced toward the lake. "Beauty and sorrow have always shared the same face for me." They stood there, the sound of wind and water filling the space between them. Harriet wanted to speak, but found no words that would not sound either foolish or too honest. Finally, she said, "You were right." He turned to her, puzzled. "About what?" "Remembering. Sometimes it is all that keeps us alive." The faintest smile curved his mouth, more felt than seen. "You understand it, then?" "I do." Their eyes held for a moment too long, and she felt a tremor in her chest. The air seemed thinner, fragile. She could almost hear the unspoken question beneath his calm exterior. "Have you known loss too?" But neither dared to ask aloud. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reflective. "You have the kind of courage that frightens people, Miss Moore. It is not loud or reckless. It is quiet, and quiet courage unsettles the world." Her breath caught. "I did not know courage could be mistaken for silence." "Oh, it can," he said gently. "Most people mistake stillness for weakness. They do not see what it costs to remain calm." Harriet felt the words enter her like a key turning in a long-locked door. "And what does it cost you, my lord?" He looked away toward the hills, his jaw tightening slightly. "More than I can admit." The conversation ended there, but something had changed. The distance between them, social, emotional, moral, was still vast, yet in that moment they both felt its boundaries shift. He bowed slightly, a gesture as formal as it was sincere. "Good afternoon, Miss Moore," she curtsied. "Good afternoon, my lord." As he walked away along the path, she watched him until the trees swallowed his figure. The wind stirred again, scattering small ripples across the lake's surface, as if echoing the quiet unrest within her heart. That evening, back in her cottage, Harriet sat by the fire with the book open once more. The inked margins seemed to burn brighter under the glow of the flames. She wanted to write a reply in the empty space beneath his words, but stopped herself. What would she say? That she understood him, that his loneliness mirrored her own. It would be madness. And yet, as the clock struck 9, she found herself dipping a quill into ink and writing softly in her neat, feminine hand. Perhaps remembering is not enough. Perhaps it is time to live. The next day she returned the book to Mrs. Pennington, who promised to send it on to another parishioner. Harriet said nothing of the note she had added, but deep down she hoped, irrationally, that the book might one day return to him. Days passed, filled with quiet routines and thoughts that refused to settle. Harriet helped an elderly neighbor with mending, visited the church, and pretended to be indifferent to the rumors swirling around the Marquis. They said he was cold, detached, haunted by guilt over his late wife's passing. She listened without answering, though something inside her rebelled against the cruelty of gossip. One evening, while walking home from the village, she saw a figure ahead on the path. The sun was setting, gilding the fields in amber light. As she drew closer, she recognized him. He had dismounted from his horse and was standing by a low stone wall, gazing at the valley below. "My lord," she greeted, her voice cautious yet warm. He turned, offering a small bow. "Miss Moore, I hope you are not lost in these endless paths." "Not lost," she replied, "only thinking. It seems one cannot walk here without falling into reflection." "That is why I come," he said. "To think, and sometimes to forget." She looked up at him, the fading light catching the lines of his face, the quiet strength there. "Do you succeed?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "No. Forgetting is harder than grief itself." Their gazes met again, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to still. She could feel the ache in his words, the loneliness he carried like a shadow stitched to his soul. Without meaning to, she said, "Then perhaps you have not yet met the reason to try again." He studied her face, his expression unreadable, and then said with grave sincerity, "Some of us do not deserve such reasons." Harriet's throat tightened. "And yet," she whispered, "we find them anyway." A silence followed, heavy with everything neither dared confess. The sun dipped lower, the air cooling around them. When she finally turned to leave, he spoke once more. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain, "if you ever wish to borrow another book, Ravensmere Hall has many that would welcome gentler hands than mine." Her heart stirred painfully. "Thank you, my lord. I may accept that kindness someday." He bowed again, but the gesture felt less like courtesy and more like acknowledgement. When she walked away, she could feel his gaze following her, not possessive, but searching, as though she were a poem he had once begun and never finished. That night, Harriet stood at her window long after the candles had burned low. The valley lay beneath her in quiet shadow, the lake glimmering faintly in the moonlight. She thought of his words, of his restraint, of the longing that pulsed beneath every silence between them. Somewhere beyond those hills, at Ravensmere Hall, she imagined him standing by his own window, perhaps looking out at the same moon, perhaps remembering the same brief conversation by the water. For the first time in many years, Harriet felt something awaken, a fragile warmth that frightened her with its sweetness. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering to the night, "Remembering is not enough." And though no one heard her, the words felt like a promise, quietly written in the margins of her soul. The morning mist lingered longer than usual over Ambleside, shrouding the valley in a quiet silver haze. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the air was soft, almost mournful. Harriet Moore fastened her cloak and stepped outside, her boots dampened by the grass, as she followed the winding path that led toward the lake. There was something magnetic about that place, its stillness, its calm, the way it seemed to hold the world's unspoken sorrows. It was where she often went to think, and lately to remember. The past week had passed in a blur of ordinary duties, visits to neighbors, quiet meals, polite conversation, but beneath that routine pulsed an energy she could not name. Every sound, every glance, every shift in the air seemed charged with possibility. Ever since that encounter by the water, she carried with her a quiet awareness of James Blackwood, not his title, not his reputation, but his presence. His silence that spoke louder than words. The path bent around the curve of the hill and descended toward the lower meadow. There, by the stone wall where the land met the open field, she saw him. Ravensmere's horses grazed in the distance, their dark shapes half vanished in the mist, and beside them stood the Marquess himself, holding the reins of one of the animals, his coat dark against the pale morning. He turned as if sensing her before she had made a sound. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat she hesitated, unsure whether to continue. But he inclined his head slightly, the smallest of gestures, one that invited without demanding. She crossed the meadow slowly, the soft mud clinging to her boots, her pulse quickening with every step. "My lord," she greeted, her voice steadier than she felt. "Miss Moore," he replied. "I fear I've trespassed upon your solitude again." She smiled faintly. "Then we are equally guilty, for it seems I have trespassed upon yours." A ghost of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps solitude is not as sacred as we pretend, or perhaps we both seek it for the same reason." "And what reason is that?" she asked softly. "To escape company," he said after a pause, "including our own." The simplicity of his confession disarmed her. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and rain, and a bird called somewhere high above them, its cry distant and solitary. Harriet glanced toward the lake, shimmering faintly through the mist. "You come here often," she said. "Too often, perhaps," he answered. "The place does not judge." "Unlike people," she murmured, almost to herself. His gaze moved back to her. "You have noticed it, then?" "How could I not?" she replied, turning toward him. "Ambleside is a kind village in appearance, but kindness and curiosity wear the same face here." He smiled slightly, though there was no joy in it. "And which face have they shown you?" "The polite one," she said, "the kind that asks nothing but already assumes everything." There was a silence after that, a silence so profound it seemed almost tender. She felt the weight of his eyes upon her, and knew that in him she had found someone who understood what it meant to live beneath unspoken judgment. He looked away first, toward the horse that stood waiting patiently beside him. "Would you like to walk?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, aware of what it might look like if anyone saw them together, yet the temptation of his company, of that rare understanding, was too strong. "Yes," she said simply. They walked along the edge of the field, their steps in rhythm, the sound of boots on damp earth blending with the rustle of the breeze. The mist thickened around them, softening the world, making everything feel suspended in time. "Do you miss the city, Miss Moore?" he asked after a while. I miss what it once promised, she said thoughtfully. Freedom, purpose, but it gives those things only to certain people, and I was not one of them. He glanced at her, intrigued. You speak like someone who has learned to expect little from the world. She smiled without humor. Expectation is a luxury for the protected. The rest of us learn to be grateful for moments of peace. He nodded slowly, the movement thoughtful. You remind me of someone I once knew. She looked up at him. Someone you admired? His expression darkened, though not with anger. Someone I failed. Harriet's steps faltered and she looked at him, searching his face. He did not elaborate, but the pain that flickered across his features told her more than words could. She felt a sudden urge to offer comfort, but instinct restrained her. He was a man who hid his wounds with dignity. Pity would only dishonor that. Instead, she said quietly, Then perhaps you will succeed with someone else. He turned his gaze to her, and for a moment the world seemed to still. I no longer believe I deserve that chance. Deserving is rarely the question, she answered. It's whether one has the courage to accept what is offered. His lips parted slightly, as if he meant to reply, but the sound of voices in the distance interrupted them. Two riders were approaching along the path, a pair of local landowners and their wives heading toward the market. Harriet's stomach tightened. Gossip in Ambleside was as swift as the wind. James seemed to understand immediately. He stepped back, maintaining a proper distance, his tone shifting to one of polite indifference. Thank you for your company, Miss Moore, he said loud enough for the riders to hear. She inclined her head with practiced composure. Good morning, my lord. They passed each other as though nothing had ever happened, though their eyes met briefly. An acknowledgement, a silent understanding of the fragility of their connection. That evening, Harriet sat by the hearth, her needle paused above the fabric she was mending. The fire crackled softly, and her thoughts drifted back to the mist, to his voice, to the way he had looked at her, as if she were something both dangerous and necessary. She did not realize she had stopped sewing until the clock struck 8. A soft knock startled her. When she opened the door, a small boy stood there, clutching a parcel. Message for Miss Moore, he said, handing it over before darting back into the night. She closed the door and set the package on the table. It was a book, bound in worn leather, without any accompanying note. She opened it and saw that it was a collection of essays, the margins filled with fine handwriting she recognized instantly. The same measured script, the same quiet reflections. At the top of the first page was a single line, written in pencil, for those who seek peace and find only questions. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the words. She knew she should not keep it, that accepting even this small token blurred a line no one else would forgive her for crossing. Yet she could not bring herself to return it. The next morning, she walked the long way around the village to clear her mind. The air was brisk, carrying the scent of frost and pine. As she turned a corner near the smithy, she nearly collided with a man she did not expect to see so soon. Miss Moore, James said, his tone formal, though his eyes softened as they met hers. You received the book. I did, she replied quietly. It was not necessary. Perhaps not, he said, but necessary things rarely bring comfort. Their conversation was brief, restrained, but beneath every word lay an intensity that made Harriet's pulse race. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how his words had filled the emptiness of her small cottage, but she could not trust herself to speak without trembling. He must have sensed her unease, for he inclined his head slightly and said, If you wish, you may return it when the reading no longer brings peace. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Then I may never return it. For the first time his composure faltered. The corner of his mouth lifted, the faintest smile. Then I shall not expect it. He walked away before she could reply, his long stride unhurried, his figure disappearing into the morning fog. That night Harriet opened the book again, her eyes tracing the inked words as though they were a conversation between them. She read until the fire burned low, until the chill crept through the room and her eyelids grew heavy. Yet even when she closed her eyes, she saw him, the way his voice deepened when he spoke softly, the way his gloved hands rested behind his back as though keeping the world at a careful distance. Days passed, each filled with the quiet ache of anticipation. Sometimes she saw him across the square or at the church, always at a distance, always dignified. They never spoke in public, but their glances met like threads, weaving a secret fabric of understanding. One morning, as she left the bakery with a parcel of bread, she saw him standing by his horse near the edge of the road. The sunlight broke through the clouds just then, painting the damp cobblestones in gold. He lifted his hat slightly in greeting. "Miss Moore," he said, his tone calm, yet there was warmth in it, a warmth carefully concealed from watching eyes. "My lord," she answered, her voice steady, though her heart trembled. He hesitated, as if weighing propriety against desire, then said quietly, "If you walk by the lake tomorrow, you may find it particularly beautiful at dusk." And then he was gone. That night, Harriet could not sleep. She sat by the window, the moonlight silvering her profile, the book he had given her resting open on her lap. She turned to the final page, where another note had been added in the margin, words she had not noticed before. "Beauty does not always heal, but it reminds us that life still wishes to be lived." She touched the words with trembling fingers. Something within her stirred, a fragile, dangerous hope she had sworn she would never feel again. When dawn came, she stood at her doorway, her cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders, watching the valley awaken. The mist was beginning to rise, curling upward like breath from sleeping earth. She did not yet know what awaited her by the lake, but she knew she would go. And for the first time since her return to Ambleside, the silence around her no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for two hearts too long afraid to beat in the same rhythm. The winter air arrived early that year, crisp and perfumed with wood smoke. In Ambleside, every cottage window glowed with amber light, and the streets echoed with the sound of carriage wheels over frozen mud. The entire village seemed to anticipate one thing, the annual winter ball at the Pennington Assembly Rooms, a tradition that promised both gossip and spectacle. Harriet Moore had not planned to attend. She had convinced herself that such gatherings were frivolous, that she had no taste for music or chatter. Yet as the days grew shorter and the invitations grew more insistent, she found herself unable to refuse. Perhaps, she told herself, it was curiosity, perhaps defiance, but beneath her careful reasoning lay something she would not name, a quiet, tremulous hope she did not dare acknowledge even to herself. By afternoon, the cottage was cold enough for her breath to show. Harriet dressed slowly, layer by layer, before the small mirror by the fire. Her gown, made of pale grey silk with faint embroidery along the hem, had been altered by her own hands. It was modest compared to the gowns worn by ladies of title, yet its simplicity lent her a grace that needed no embellishment. Her hair was pinned low, with a single silver comb that caught the candlelight. As she fastened her gloves, her reflection met her gaze, steady, poised, though her pulse betrayed her calm. When she arrived at the assembly rooms, the warmth inside nearly stole her breath. The air shimmered with candlelight and perfume, with laughter and music that rose and fell like waves. Chandeliers swayed gently from the motion of the dancers, and mirrors along the walls reflected a blur of colour, satin blues, deep crimsons, and the soft glint of jewellery. She stood near the entrance, taking in the scene, when Mrs. Pennington descended upon her with delighted authority. "My dear Miss Moore, how perfectly charming you look, and punctual too, as always. Come, I must introduce you to Mr. Lark, such a respectable gentleman." Harriet smiled with practised courtesy, though her eyes, almost unconsciously, scanned the crowd. She did not have to look long. James Blackwood stood on the far side of the ballroom, near the great mantel where the fire burned high. His coat was black, his cravat white as frost, his posture unbending. He did not dance. He never did. Instead, he stood as though the world around him existed at a different tempo. He, the observer, calm and silent, apart from the spectacle. Yet even across the room, Harriet could feel it, the subtle gravity that drew her toward him. Mr. Lark appeared at her side with a bow that was too deep to be graceful. "Miss Moore, it is a pleasure. Mrs. Pennington tells me you are fond of reading. I confess, I am quite the collector of books myself, though my interest lies more in law than poetry." "Then you have my admiration," Harriet replied politely. "Poetry moves the heart. Law, I think, must exhaust it." He laughed, slightly louder than necessary. "Ah, a sharp wit. A rare quality in Ambleside, I must say. I hope, Miss Moore, that you might grant me the honour of the next dance." Her instinct was to refuse, but a ripple of polite anticipation moved through the nearby guests, and she could feel their eyes upon her. Refusal would draw attention. Compliance would cost her nothing. "Of course," she said gently. "The next dance." When the music began, she placed her hand in his and followed him to the center of the floor. The violins sang a bright melody, and couples began to move in perfect, practiced rhythm. Harriet danced with measured grace, her movements light, her expression serene. Yet her gaze, drawn as if by magnetism, found its way to the far wall. James was watching her. His eyes followed her across every turn, every measured step. There was nothing improper in his expression, only stillness and a depth of feeling that made her heart falter. For a moment, she forgot her partner's name, the room, the music. The world narrowed until only that look remained. Mr. Lark spoke, jolting her back. "You are quite an accomplished dancer, Miss Moore. I dare say you put the rest of us to shame." She smiled faintly, not hearing half of what he said. Her mind had drifted beyond the reach of conversation. When the music ended, she curtsied politely and excused herself. Her pulse quickened, not from the dance, but from the realization that she could no longer pretend indifference. She crossed to the terrace doors and slipped outside into the cold night air. The contrast was startling. Inside, heat and laughter; outside, silence and frost. The stars hung low over the lake, and the wind carried the faintest scent of snow. She leaned against the stone balustrade, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You seem determined to freeze this evening," a low voice said behind her. She turned sharply. James stood a few paces away, the light from the windows outlining his tall frame, his features softened by shadow. "My lord," she said, startled, "I thought you remained indoors." "I find I prefer the quiet of the night to the noise of the crowd," he replied. "But I did not expect to find anyone else brave enough to face the cold." "I am not brave," she said softly, "merely restless." He approached slowly, stopping at a proper distance, though the air between them seemed to pulse with unspoken things. "Restlessness," he said, "is often the mark of those who think too deeply, or feel too much," she answered. Their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze the same ache she carried, the longing to speak freely, the fear of being seen too clearly. "You danced beautifully," he said after a moment. Her lips parted in surprise. "You were watching." He gave a faint, ironic smile. I could hardly help it. The admission struck her with unexpected force. The wind stirred the ends of her hair, and she felt her composure tremble. "And did you approve, my lord?" "I am not certain my opinion is worth offering," he replied quietly. "I am told I see the world in shadows. But tonight, Miss Moore, I saw light, and it was you." Her breath caught. She looked away toward the frozen lake, afraid that if she held his gaze any longer, the walls she had built around her heart would collapse. "You should not say such things," she whispered, "because they are untrue, because they are dangerous." He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. "Danger is a matter of what one fears to lose. I have already lost everything that made me careful." She turned back to him, her heart tightening at the vulnerability in his tone. "And yet you remain cautious." He studied her face, the faint tremor of her lips, the reflection of firelight in her eyes. "Only where you are concerned." The words hung between them like breath in cold air, visible, fragile, real. Harriet could feel her pulse echoing in her throat. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she murmured. "Perhaps not," he said. "But there are moments that weigh more than years. And I have felt more truth in your silence than in a lifetime of conversation." For a heartbeat, she stood perfectly still, unable to look away. The sound of the ballroom drifted faintly through the open doors. The music, the laughter, the world that would not understand. She stepped back, her voice trembling. "If we are seen, then I will bear the consequence," he said. "I will not let you." The quiet defiance in her tone drew the faintest curve of admiration to his lips. "You would protect me, Miss Moore? I would protect what little peace remains to either of us." He looked at her then, as if memorizing every detail, the frost on her lashes, the way her breath clouded the air, the fragile steadiness of her voice. "Peace," he said softly, "is a luxury I forfeited long ago." A gust of wind swept through the terrace, carrying the sound of bells from the church tower. Harriet shivered, but not from the cold. "You should return inside," he said gently, "before they notice your absence. And you, my lord, I prefer the company of stars to that of suspicion." Her lips curved faintly. "Then I shall leave you to your stars." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Moore." She faced him again, her pulse quickening. "If I have said too much, forgive me," he said, his tone quieter now, almost tender. "I do not wish to add to your burdens, only to let you know that someone, perhaps unworthy, sees you, truly sees you." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Harriet felt tears threaten behind her calm. "It is not unworthy to see," she said softly, "only dangerous to feel." Their gazes lingered a moment longer, the air between them taut with all that could not be spoken. Then she curtsied with slow grace and returned inside, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed not from the cold, but from the unguarded truth that had passed between them. Inside, the ball continued, as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. The chandeliers still gleamed, the laughter still rose, the violins still danced. But Harriet moved through it like someone half awake, half dreaming, aware only of the memory that had taken root inside her, a memory of grey eyes and whispered honesty beneath a winter sky. Across the room, James remained near the terrace doors, his figure outlined by the glow of the fire. For a long while, he did not move. The warmth of the ballroom did not reach him. He stood in the border between light and shadow, watching her from a distance he dared not cross again. When Harriet finally turned, their eyes met once more across the crowded room. No one else noticed, no one else needed to. The music swelled, filling every corner with sound. But the silence between them said more than the symphony ever could. And though neither of them moved, both knew that something irrevocable had begun, not in words, not in action, but in the trembling stillness of a winter night, where hearts dared what lips could not confess. Morning came draped in fog, the kind that blurred the outlines of every roof and field, as though the world wished to keep its truths veiled a little longer. The bells of St. Mary's tolled faintly through the mist, and Harriet Moore stood at her window, watching the valley awaken in pale silence. The winter ball was behind her now, yet its memory clung to her like perfume, soft, lingering, impossible to forget. Every detail returned to her in flashes, the gleam of chandeliers, the sound of violins, and his voice beneath the night sky. "Someone sees you." She could still hear those words, still feel the pulse that had followed them. And though she tried to tell herself it had been a moment of weakness, nothing more, the truth pressed against her heart with unrelenting force. The village had not forgotten the ball either. Ambleside lived on whispers, and whispers were more dangerous than storms. Already, Mrs. Pennington had come calling, with an air of cheerful curiosity that barely concealed her purpose. "My dear Miss Moore," she said, setting down her muff and removing her gloves, as though she intended to stay for an interrogation. "I do hope you enjoyed the evening. You looked quite radiant, though I noticed you disappeared for some time. I trust all was well?" Harriet kept her composure with a practiced smile. "Perfectly well, thank you. The air outside was refreshing after so much heat and noise." Mrs. Pennington's eyes sparkled with meaning. "Indeed, it does tend to grow rather warm indoors, especially when one finds stimulating conversation near the terrace doors." Harriet met her gaze without flinching. The view of the lake was lovely. The older woman's smile faltered slightly, defeated by the calmness of Harriet's tone. "Yes, quite. Well, I am sure no one would ever think otherwise." When her visitor finally left, Harriet stood by the hearth, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward serenity. She knew what that tone meant, what it always meant in a village like Ambleside. Every gesture was dissected, every glance measured against propriety. One wrong word could destroy a reputation faster than a fire could consume a house. Still, she could not regret the moment they had shared. She would rather have 1 hour of truth than a lifetime of polite emptiness. Later that week, a letter arrived from the rector's wife, inviting her to assist in sorting donations for the Winter Relief Committee. Harriet accepted. It would be unwise to withdraw from society, just as its scrutiny had turned toward her. That Saturday, she made her way to the rectory, the ground slick with melting frost. The room was bustling when she arrived, women folding linens, sorting blankets, and whispering in corners. The smell of tea and starch filled the air. As Harriet took her seat near the window, she realized with a small shock that the rector's wife was not the only one presiding over the effort. James Blackwood stood near the far table, speaking quietly with the rector himself. His presence seemed to draw all light toward him. The dark richness of his coat, the contrast of his white cravat, the calm precision of his movements. When he turned and saw her, a flicker of surprise passed across his features, quickly tempered into politeness. He inclined his head in greeting, and Harriet felt her heart betray her, skipping a beat that she hoped no one would hear. The afternoon passed in a haze of measured civility. She kept her attention fixed on her task, folding blankets, arranging lists. But every so often she felt his gaze upon her, as though he were trying to read her thoughts from across the room. When the meeting concluded, the others began to gather their things, and she lingered by the window to collect her gloves. "You endured the afternoon bravely," came his quiet voice behind her. She turned, startled but not displeased. "You make it sound like battle." "In Ambleside," he said with a faint, rueful smile. "It is." She allowed herself a small laugh. "Then I suppose we both survived, with minimal injury." "I am not so certain," he said softly, his gaze steady on hers. "Some wounds do not show." Her breath caught. "You should not speak like that." "I should not," he agreed, "but I cannot seem to stop." The words fell between them like sparks, too bright for such a restrained room. Harriet lowered her voice, glancing toward the open door. "People will see, my lord." "Then let them see," he replied, his tone low but firm. "I am weary of being a ghost among them." She shook her head. "You know they would not forgive me as easily as they forgive you." He stepped closer, his expression solemn. "Miss Moore, forgiveness is overrated. What one should seek is understanding." "And do you understand me?" she asked, meeting his gaze fully now. "I am trying to," he said, "but every time I believe I do, you step back into the shadows." Her eyes softened. "Perhaps I belong there." "Then allow me," he said, his voice quiet but urgent, "to meet you there." For a moment she could not breathe. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken things: fear, longing, truth. Then, from the corridor, came the sound of approaching voices. Harriet stepped back instinctively, the spell broken. "You should go," she whispered. He inclined his head slightly, as though accepting a command. "Until the shadows allow again," he said, and left without another word. That night, sleep refused to come. The fire had burned low, casting the room in amber glow. Harriet sat in her armchair, the letter she had begun hours earlier abandoned on the desk. The silence pressed around her until she could no longer bear it. She reached for the worn leather book he had once given her, the one with his handwriting in the margins. Turning to the last page, she found a line she had overlooked before, written faintly in pencil. "The past is a place I cannot leave, but perhaps someone might come and find me there." Her fingers traced the words. She did not weep, but her throat tightened with a sorrow that was not her own, yet had somehow become part of her. Days later, a small gathering was held at the Ravensmere estate, a charitable meeting arranged by Mrs. Pennington and the rector under the guise of planning aid for the poor. Harriet hesitated before accepting the invitation, knowing full well what it would mean to cross that threshold. Yet when the carriage arrived, she stepped inside. The great doors of Ravensmere Hall opened with solemn grace. The house was as she had imagined, tall ceilings, dark wood gleaming with polish, portraits watching from gilded frames. Yet despite its grandeur, the place felt lonely, like a heart that had forgotten how to beat. James greeted her with quiet courtesy. "Miss Moore," he said, bowing slightly, "I am honored that you accepted." "I was told my presence was required," she replied with a soft smile. "Then I am grateful to whoever made the demand." She tried to appear composed, but her pulse betrayed her calm. They moved through the hall toward the drawing room, where a small fire burned and the scent of roses mingled with cedar. The other guests spoke cheerfully of crops, weather, and the success of the last harvest, their laughter filling the space where honesty could not live. Harriet sat near the fire, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. James stood by the mantel, responding politely when addressed but contributing little. His gaze drifted toward her whenever conversation allowed. When the meeting ended and the guests began to depart, Mrs. Pennington lingered, bustling with chatter and flattery. Harriet waited by the door, preparing to leave, when James approached her. "May I show you something before you go?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, aware that the rector's wife still hovered nearby. But Mrs. Pennington's attention soon turned elsewhere, and Harriet found herself nodding. "Yes, my lord." He led her down a long corridor to a smaller room, lit only by the pale glow of a single window. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and folded maps. "This was her room," he said softly. "My late wife's. I have not entered it in years." Harriet's breath caught. "Why bring me here?" "Because," he said, his eyes dark and distant, "it is time someone saw it not as a tomb, but as a memory." She looked around. The room was simple, yet elegant. A desk covered with dust, a faded bouquet still standing in a porcelain vase, a shawl draped over the back of a chair, as though its owner might return at any moment. Harriet turned to him, her voice barely audible. "You have lived in mourning too long, my lord." "I have lived in silence," he said. "Mourning would at least have been honest." Her heart ached for him, for the restraint, the loneliness, the weight he carried behind every word. "And now?" she asked gently. "Now," he said, stepping closer, "I find myself speaking when I should remain silent." The nearness of him made her breath falter. His hand, gloved and steady, rested for a moment against the edge of the desk, inches from hers. "You do not need to speak," she whispered. "Some things are understood without words." He looked at her then, with such intensity that the room itself seemed to hold its breath. "Then tell me," he murmured, "what do you understand, Miss Moore?" She hesitated, every instinct torn between caution and truth. "That you are a man trying to live again," she said softly, "and that frightens you." His expression softened, pain, hope, and something deeper passing through it. "And you," he said, his voice lower still, "are the reason I might try." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they could not yet say. When Harriet finally left Ravensmere Hall that evening, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the air smelled faintly of rain. She walked home through the fading light, her thoughts a storm of emotion. She knew the world would not forgive her for the tenderness blooming in her heart, but for once she did not care. Because for the first time, she understood the truth that had been growing between them since that first night in the ballroom. Love, in its quietest form, could still be scandal enough to change a life. The days following Harriet's visit to Ravensmere Hall unfolded with an unnerving quiet, the kind that feels too deliberate, too poised before a storm. The valley lay beneath a ceiling of grey clouds, and the lake, usually serene, mirrored the restlessness that had begun to stir in Ambleside. Rumours, like wind through tall grass, moved swiftly and without direction, carrying fragments of truth distorted into poison. Harriet did not yet know the shape those whispers had taken, but she could feel their weight in the way conversations fell silent when she entered a room, or how Mrs. Pennington's smile now trembled beneath its own sweetness. She had lived long enough among the polite cruelty of small villages to recognize when she was being gently pushed to the edge of respectability. On the morning the scandal truly began, the mist was so thick that the church steeple vanished into the clouds. Harriet had gone walking early, drawn by the rare solitude the weather offered. The damp grass bent under her steps, and the path that wound along the lake was quiet except for the distant bleat of sheep. She walked without haste, her shawl drawn tightly, her mind crowded with thoughts she could not untangle. It was near the old stone bridge that she saw him. James Blackwood stood on the opposite side, his greatcoat unbuttoned, the wind catching the edge of it as he turned. The sight of him, unexpected and yet familiar, sent a tremor through her chest. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice low but warm against the chill air. "My lord," she replied, her breath visible between them. "I did not expect company so early." "Nor I," he said softly, and his expression shifted into something she could not name. "Though I confess, I hoped for it." Her heart faltered, though she managed a faint smile. "You speak as though the morning obeyed you." He took a step closer, his boots leaving dark impressions in the wet grass. "I wish it did," he murmured. "Then perhaps I could hold back time itself." There was no one else on the path. The world felt muted, as if the mist itself conspired to keep their secret. They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with the memory of every look, every restrained word they had ever exchanged. When Harriet finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "The world would not be kind if it saw us like this." James's gaze softened, yet his tone was steady. "Let the world see what it chooses. I am weary of its judgment." She shook her head. "You may survive its cruelty. I would not." He hesitated, then reached out as though to reassure her, his gloved hand brushing her sleeve. Barely a touch, yet enough to send warmth through her entire body. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I forget how fragile peace can be for those who are watched." "Not fragile," she corrected gently. "Simply rare." Their eyes met again, and in that look there was something unspoken, something both sacred and perilous. Harriet knew she should leave, that every heartbeat spent in his presence risked her reputation and her reason alike. Yet she could not bring herself to move. A sound in the distance startled them, the faint crunch of footsteps approaching from the fog. Harriet turned, panic flashing across her face. James instinctively stepped back, creating a gulf of propriety between them. A moment later, two figures emerged from the mist. Mrs. Pennington and her visiting cousin arm in arm, their eyes widening in simultaneous recognition. "Oh!" Mrs. Pennington exclaimed, her tone dripping with false surprise. "Lord Ravensmere, Miss Moore! How unexpected to find you both here." Harriet managed a composed smile. "The morning is fine for walking, though the mist is heavier than I imagined." "Yes," Mrs. Pennington said with thinly veiled satisfaction. "And yet, such solitude. How fortunate you both are to have found one another." Her cousin smirked, whispering something that made the older woman chuckle behind her glove. James's face remained impassive, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his anger. "Good day, Mrs. Pennington," he said evenly. "I hope the weather serves you better on your return." The woman curtsied shallowly, her eyes bright with gossip already forming. "And to you, my lord. I dare say the morning has already served you quite delightfully." Then, when they were gone, Harriet stood motionless, the echo of their laughter fading into the fog. She turned to James, her eyes wide with dread. "It will spread before noon." "Yes," he said, his voice dark. "It will." Her composure cracked then, fear rushing in like cold water. "I cannot bear to be spoken of, to be made into something I am not. You know how they are. Once they decide a story, nothing can undo it." He looked at her, his expression torn between fury and helplessness. "Then let them speak of me, not you. I will take the blame." She shook her head. "They will never blame you. You are the widowed Marquis. They will call it a tragedy for you and a shame for me." He stepped closer, his voice breaking through the quiet. "Then what am I to do, Harriet? Pretend I do not care? Pretend I have not looked for you every day since that night?" Her name on his lips undid her. She turned away, trembling. "You must," she whispered, "for both our sakes." He said nothing more, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. When she finally walked away, she did not look back. By midday, Ambleside was humming with speculation. The story grew with every retelling, how they had been found alone by the lake, how his hand had lingered on her arm, how the mist had been their only witness. Each version added a touch more scandal, and by evening the polite smiles Harriet received at the grocer's had turned into distant nods. At the rectory, the whispers became open concern. "She is clever," someone murmured, "but clever women always bring trouble." When Harriet learned that even Mr. Lark, the ever-attentive solicitor, had begun to defend her name a little too loudly, she understood what that defense would cost her. A woman protected by one man could be forgiven. A woman admired by two would be destroyed. The following afternoon, Lark called upon her uninvited, his expression a portrait of practiced sympathy. "Miss Moore," he said, removing his hat, "I come only as a friend. I cannot bear to hear what they say. You must allow me to help." "I need no defense," she replied, her voice calm though her heart raced. He frowned. "No defense. Miss Moore, Ambleside is not forgiving. They will twist the truth until you scarcely recognize yourself." "I would rather be silent than owe my peace to gossip," she said firmly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then let me silence them another way. Marry me." The words struck her like thunder. "Mr. Lark, hear me out," he insisted. "Marriage would end their talk. They would see you as respectable, protected, above reproach. You would have safety, comfort, a home." She met his gaze steadily. "And what would you have?" He hesitated. "Only your gratitude. Perhaps in time your affection." Her answer came without hesitation. "No." He blinked, stunned. "You cannot mean it." "I do." "Think carefully," he pressed, his tone darkening. "Refusing me now will not only prolong your suffering, it will make it worse. People will wonder why you turned down an honorable offer." Harriet drew herself up, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Let them wonder. My life is not theirs to arrange." The mask of civility slipped from his face for an instant, revealing something harder, more self-serving. "You are making a mistake," he said sharply. "One you will come to regret." "I have lived with regret before," she said quietly. "It does not frighten me." When he left, the silence of the cottage felt colder than ever. She sank into her chair, her pulse still racing. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the lake. That night, as she sat by the fire, there came a knock at the door, soft but insistent. Her heart leapt and then steadied when she opened it. James stood there, the rain on his coat, his hair damp from the storm. "You should not have come," she said, though her voice betrayed no anger. "I could not stay away," he said simply. "They are tearing you apart for something that was nothing." "It was not nothing," she whispered. He met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. "No," he said softly, "it was not." For a long moment they stood there, the sound of rain between them like the echo of all that could not be spoken. Then she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He crossed the threshold, and the faint glow of the fire fell across his face. "I will stop this," he said quietly. "I will speak to them, to anyone who dares to question your name." "And what will you tell them?" she asked, trembling. "That you found me by the lake because you could not stay away? That you touched my arm because it felt too cruel not to? Every defense will sound like confession." He closed his eyes briefly, as though the truth itself pained him. "Then let them believe what they will," he said. "If they must invent a story, I would rather it be one where I am guilty of loving you than one where I am indifferent." Her heart broke at the quiet certainty in his voice. She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "You cannot say such things, my lord. I already have." They stood inches apart, the air between them charged with all the restraint of months unspoken. The flames cast soft light over her face, over the sorrow and strength that had drawn him from the first moment. He reached out, not to touch her, but to let his fingers hover near hers, their warmth mingling without contact. "Harriet," he said softly, her name almost a prayer. "If I could take your pain, I would. But you must know, you are not alone in it." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Then tell me," she whispered, "how does one live beneath so many eyes and still remain true?" He smiled faintly, the sadness in it deeper than words. "By remembering that truth is the only thing they cannot take." The rain continued outside, relentless and cold, but within the small cottage the world felt suspended, held between ruin and grace. Harriet did not know what would come of the storm that had begun, but in that fragile moment, as firelight danced across his face, she knew this. She would rather face 1,000 rumors than return to a life untouched by him. And so the night stretched on, the wind howling beyond the window, the lake restless under the clouds. In Ambleside, tongues would wag until morning, but within that quiet room, two hearts beat in defiance of them all, each aware that love, once awakened, could no longer hide in the mist. The storm that had shaken Ambleside left behind a world washed clean, but uneasy, as though the rain had rinsed away appearances and left only truths glimmering beneath the surface. The lake shone like glass that morning, pale and still, under a sky of drifting clouds. Every sound seemed sharper, the cry of distant birds, the creak of carriage wheels, the whisper of wind against stone. And in that uneasy calm, Harriet Moore walked toward Ravensmere Hall. Her decision had not been made lightly. She had not slept since James's visit 2 nights before, haunted by the look in his eyes and the words he had spoken. "If they must invent a story, let it be one where I am guilty of loving you." The phrase echoed in her mind like a vow and a warning. He had meant it as protection, but to her it sounded like surrender, and Harriet Moore was not a woman who surrendered easily. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she climbed the hill, her cloak drawn close, her heart a wild, steady drum. She told herself she had come for answers, for truth, but beneath that resolve pulsed something she could not deny. She longed to see him, to understand the man whose silence had become her solace and her torment. When the great house finally came into view, it rose from the mist like a memory that refused to fade. Solemn, grand, and heartbreakingly still. The iron gates stood open, though no one waited to announce her. She entered quietly, her boots crunching over gravel, her pulse quickening with every step. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of cedar and firewood. The portraits lining the corridor seemed to watch her as she passed, faces of ancestors, noble and unsmiling, each bearing the same proud features that James carried like an inheritance of duty. A servant met her halfway through the corridor, startled by her unexpected presence, but she spoke with calm authority. "Tell your master that Miss Moore requests a word," she said. "I will wait in the study." The servant hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing. Harriet entered the study, her hands trembling as she removed her gloves. The room was dim but elegant, filled with the scent of paper, ink, and smoke. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, and a faint fire glowed in the grate. She stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, and tried to steady her thoughts. When the door opened, she turned. James stood in the doorway, surprise flashing briefly across his face before yielding to something softer, something dangerously close to relief. "Miss Moore," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I had not expected—" "No," she interrupted, her voice calm but trembling underneath. "I do not imagine you did. And yet, here I am." He studied her carefully, as though unsure whether her visit was mercy or accusation. "Then allow me to ask what brings you, when the world has made it clear you should stay far from me." Harriet met his gaze with steady resolve. "Because I will not allow that same world to decide who I am, or who you are. I came to hear the truth from your own lips." He went still, his expression unreadable. "The truth is seldom kind, Miss Moore." "Kindness does not interest me," she said, "only honesty." For a moment, silence reigned. Then slowly, he crossed the room and stood by the fireplace, his hand resting on the mantel. The light from the flames cast his face in sharp relief, the strong lines of his jaw, the shadow beneath his eyes, the fatigue of a man long at war with himself. "When my wife died," he began, his tone low, deliberate, "they said it was of illness. They were not wrong, but they did not know the whole of it. Her body was frail, her mind more so. She lived in a world of fear and fever that no tenderness could reach. And yet, I loved her. God knows I did." Harriet listened without interruption, though her chest ached at the sorrow in his voice. "One night," he continued, "she took ill again, worse than before. I sent for the physician, but by the time he arrived, she was gone. I was blamed for her solitude, for her despair, for the very air she breathed. They said I was too cold, too proud. Perhaps I was, but I did not kill her." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Harriet's resolve faltered. She stepped closer, her eyes full of compassion. "And yet they let the rumor live." He nodded. "They needed someone to bear the weight of her death. I was convenient. A husband always is. And so I became the monster they required, a marquess in mourning, half human, half legend." She was silent for a long time, her heart twisting with understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "And now they've built a new story about you and me." "Yes." He lifted his gaze to hers. "And this one too, they will believe." Harriet looked away, her throat tightening. "Then what shall we do, my lord? Live as prisoners of their imagination?" His eyes softened. "You call me my lord even now." "It is safer," she said faintly. "Is that what I am to you? Safety?" She looked at him then, the firelight catching in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "You are the opposite of safety." He exhaled slowly, as if the words themselves undid him. "Then why do you remain?" "Because I do not wish to run any more." Their gazes locked, and for a long, breathless moment, the world outside ceased to exist. She could see every flicker of emotion in his face. The restraint, the longing, the pain, the silence between them was alive, trembling like a held breath. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "You do not know what it costs me to let you stand here." "Then do not let me," she said, stepping closer. His composure wavered. "Harriet, you said the truth was seldom kind," she interrupted, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then give me the unkind truth. Tell me if you regret me." His hand tightened against the mantel. "Regret?" He shook his head slowly. "No, you are the only thing I do not regret." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and irrevocable. Harriet's breath caught, and for the first time she saw not the marquess, not the widower, but the man. A man who had suffered too much, who had lived too long in silence, who had dared, finally, to feel again. Her voice softened. "Then let that be enough." He turned to face her fully. "Enough for what?" "For us to begin again," she said quietly. For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes, small, uncertain, but real. Then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, breaking the stillness. A knock rattled the door, followed by the voice of a servant. "My lord, forgive me. Mr. Lark is here. He insists upon speaking with you at once." Harriet stiffened, the blood draining from her face. James's expression darkened. "Tell him I am not receiving visitors." The servant hesitated. "He said it concerns Miss Moore, my lord." The words fell like stones in the silence that followed. Harriet felt her heart twist painfully. She looked toward the door, her voice barely audible. What could he possibly want? James's jaw tightened. To feed the fire he lit. A moment later the door opened, and Edwin Lark stepped inside without waiting for permission. His composure was immaculate, his expression polite, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held the upper hand. "Lord Ravensmere," he said with a bow. "Miss Moore, I do apologize for the intrusion, though I trust my presence is not entirely unwelcome." James's tone was ice. "You are mistaken." Lark smiled thinly. "I come as a friend, my lord. The village has taken quite an interest in recent events, and I fear Miss Moore's name suffers more than either of us might wish." Harriet drew herself upright, her chin lifting. "If you have come to offer your protection again, Mr. Lark, spare your breath." His eyes flickered, just for an instant, with anger. "I would never force my assistance, Miss Moore, but I do believe your reputation, fragile as it is, could yet be salvaged, provided you act wisely." James stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough! You will not threaten her under my roof." "Threaten?" Lark said with feigned innocence. "Surely not. I merely advise prudence. A single rumor can destroy a woman's standing, but a marriage, why, that can restore it entirely." Harriet's hand trembled, but she held her ground. "You mean your marriage?" Lark inclined his head. "Naturally, and though my offer was once made in kindness, I fear it must now be made in urgency. For her sake, and perhaps for yours, my lord." The tension in the room thickened until the air itself seemed ready to break. James's voice, when it came, was quiet but lethal. "Leave this house." Lark smirked, tipping his hat. "Very well, but I warn you both. Ambleside is already deciding your story. If you do not write it yourselves, they will write it for you." When he was gone, silence fell like the aftermath of thunder. Harriet pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "He means to ruin us both." James turned toward her, his expression unreadable, though his eyes burned with something fierce and unyielding. "Then let him try." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. "You cannot fight them all." "No," he said softly, "but I can stand beside you while they try to break us." Harriet felt the tears she had fought so long finally rise, her voice barely a whisper. "Then what becomes of us, my lord?" He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers with steady devotion. "Whatever the world decides, Harriet," he said, his tone low, unshaken, "I will not hide what I feel for you." And for the first time she saw what the world had refused to see in him, not scandal, not sorrow, but strength born of love. Outside, the fog thickened once more around Ravensmere Hall, wrapping its ancient walls in secrecy. But within, two souls stood in defiance of it, bound by truth, by courage, and by a love that no whisper could silence. The wind that swept across Ambleside that evening carried the scent of rain and foreboding. The clouds hung low over the valley, heavy and waiting, as though the heavens themselves hesitated before breaking. Harriet Moore stood by the window of her cottage, watching the light fade from the hills. Each passing hour felt slower than the last. Every heartbeat waited with uncertainty. The scandal that had taken root in whispers was now an open wound. She could feel it each time she walked through the village, the lingering stares, the halted greetings, the polite silence that hid venom underneath. But worse than all of it was the absence. 2 days had passed since she had last seen James Blackwood. 2 days of wondering if she had imagined the promise in his eyes, the strength in his voice when he said he would not hide what he felt for her. Perhaps she had been foolish to believe that even a man of his conviction could withstand the cruelty of society. She had just begun to draw the curtains when a knock came, firm, deliberate, unmistakable. Her heart stilled. She opened the door to find him standing there, rain beginning to darken the shoulders of his coat. "James," she breathed, unable to mask her surprise. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I should not have come at this hour, but I could not stay away." The sound of his voice, low and rough from sleepless nights, broke through her restraint. "You should not be here," she whispered, though she did not move to close the door. "If anyone sees, let them see," he interrupted gently, his gaze unwavering. "I have lived too long in the shadow of other people's opinions. I will not live there again." His words left her defenseless. She stepped aside, and he entered, bringing with him the scent of rain and the cold breath of the evening. The small room seemed to shrink with his presence. The fire flickered, casting amber light across his face. He looked tired, drawn, as though the weight of the past weeks had carved itself into his very expression. "I have been told," he began, removing his gloves slowly, "that Mr. Lark has made himself quite vocal on matters that are not his concern." Harriet's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "He seeks to humiliate me," she said softly, "and he means to use you to do it." "I am aware," James replied, his voice darkening. "He came to me again this morning. He believes I will bargain with him for your silence." Her breath caught. "And will you?" He turned toward her, his eyes sharp with resolve. "Never." For a long moment they simply stood there, the air between them charged, heavy with the unspoken. Then quietly, Harriet said, "The more you defend me, the more they will hate you." "I have endured their hatred before," he answered. "It no longer frightens me." She shook her head, stepping closer. "But it should. They will not stop until they destroy one of us." His voice softened, though his gaze held her captive. "Then let them destroy me, not you." Her composure faltered. Tears welled, but did not fall. "Do not say that." "I mean it," he said, taking a step nearer. "You have suffered enough because of me." The sound of rain began against the window pane, soft at first, then steady, a rhythm that filled the silence between them. Harriet looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Do you believe that I regret what has happened?" He hesitated, his expression uncertain. "I fear you must." She took another step, closing the distance. "Then you are wrong." The room seemed to draw its breath with hers. The fire crackled softly, the storm gathering its strength outside. "Do you not see?" she whispered. "Everything they say, everything they do, it does not matter. What I fear most is not their cruelty, but losing what little truth remains between us." He stared at her as though seeing her anew. "And what truth is that?" "That I care for you," she said simply. The words fell like a confession, fragile and irrevocable. For an instant, James did not move. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof in restless rhythm. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant, yet filled with a strength that made her heart tremble. "Say it again," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I care for you," she repeated, her voice breaking on the words. "More than I should, more than I can admit without shame, but I do." He closed his eyes, exhaling as though the weight of years had lifted from his shoulders. When he looked at her again, his expression was unguarded, his eyes burning with quiet reverence. "Then I am not alone in this madness," he said softly. "No," she whispered, "you are not." For a moment neither moved. The nearness between them pulsed with unspoken desire, restrained by everything they could not allow. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, a touch so light it could have been imagined, yet it carried more meaning than any embrace. "Harriet," he said, his voice low, almost trembling, "I have spent years trying not to feel. I buried myself in silence, convinced it was safer than hope. And then you appeared, and every truth I thought I had mastered began to unravel." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "And yet, Here we stand, caught between what is right and what is true. The world calls that sin, he murmured. The world does not know us, she replied. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley. A flash of lightning illuminated the room for an instant, casting their faces in silver light. Then darkness reclaimed it, and the only glow came from the fire, flickering between them like a fragile heartbeat. James released her hand, though reluctantly, and stepped back, his breath uneven. If I were a better man, I would leave now. And if I were a wiser woman, she said softly, I would let you. Neither moved. The words lingered between them, fragile and dangerous. He turned away first, pacing toward the window. You deserve peace, Harriet, not the ruin that follows me. Peace without meaning is emptiness, she answered, and I have known enough of that. He looked at her over his shoulder, his expression softening into something close to awe. You should not speak so bravely. It makes it harder to stay away. Then do not, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The storm deepened outside, the sound of rain now a chorus against the walls. He turned fully, his restraint fraying under the weight of her words. Do you know what you ask of me? I ask nothing, she replied, only honesty. His jaw tightened. Then hear it. I love you. The confession came like thunder, unmistakable, unstoppable. Harriet froze, her breath catching in her throat. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a tenderness that shook her to her core. I love you, he said again, quieter now, but with a conviction that filled the room. Not as a man should love, but as one who cannot help himself. It is madness, it is ruin, but it is mine, and I will not deny it any longer. Her hand flew to her mouth, as though the words themselves had struck her. She had imagined this moment, feared it, prayed against it, and yet hearing it undone her completely. James, she whispered, her voice trembling, you cannot— I already have, he said, his tone gentle but firm. And if the world burns for it, so be it. For a long moment the only sound was the storm, the relentless rain against the roof, the wind sighing through the cracks of the window. Harriet felt tears spill silently down her cheeks, but she did not look away. You will be condemned for this, she said. So be it, he repeated. Let them condemn me for the only thing that has ever made me feel alive. The firelight shimmered across his face, catching the dampness in his hair, the quiet strength in his eyes. Harriet took a slow, unsteady breath. Then let me be condemned with you. At that, his restraint broke. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her hands again, his voice rough with emotion. Do not say that unless you mean it. I do, she said through tears. Because I have lived half a life hiding from what I feel, I will not do it again. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough for the rain to soften, for the fire to settle into a steady glow. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. You are the first warmth I have known in years. And you, she said softly, are the first storm I have not feared. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both sorrow and salvation. Their foreheads nearly touched, though they did not dare close the distance. It was enough. The closeness, the truth, the fragile defiance that bound them together against a world that would never understand. Then, from outside, came the sound of hooves, distant but growing nearer. James stiffened. Harriet turned toward the window, her pulse quickening. A carriage was approaching along the muddy path, lanterns flickering through the rain. Who would come at this hour? She whispered. He frowned, moving to the window. Whoever it is, they bring no peace. As the carriage stopped before the gate, a figure stepped out, dark coat, tall hat, the glint of authority unmistakable even in the stormlight. Harriet's heart froze. Lark, James said quietly, his voice hardening. Harriet's breath caught. He would not dare. Oh, he would, James replied grimly, and now he has. The knock came, sharp, commanding, echoing through the small cottage. Harriet's blood ran cold. James turned to her, his expression steady, his voice calm despite the storm raging outside. Whatever happens, he said softly. "Do not be afraid." She met his eyes, her own filled with both terror and faith. "So long as you stand with me," she whispered, "I will not." The rain thundered louder, the door shuddered under another knock, and the firelight flickered across their faces. For one suspended moment, time seemed to hold its breath, two souls bound by love, shadowed by judgment, facing the inevitable together beneath the rain. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the damp air that clung to Ambleside like sorrow that refused to lift. Morning came grey and heavy, the light pale against the windows of Harriet Moore's cottage. The fire had long since died, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and rain. Harriet stood motionless beside the table, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The knock from the night before still echoed in her mind, the sharp, merciless sound that had shattered what little peace she and James had known. Outside, the world was still slick with rain. Slick. The village stirred slowly to life, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the storm that had settled not in the sky, but in the hearts of two people whose love had now become a matter of scandal and survival. When the door finally opened, it was not James who entered, but the man who had brought the storm to her doorstep. Edwin Lark stood in the doorway, his coat damp, his hat dripping with water. His expression was carefully arranged into civility, but there was triumph in his eyes. "Miss Moore," he said, removing his hat with mock respect, "I come not as an enemy, though you seem determined to make me one." Harriet's voice was steady, though cold. "You have already made yourself one, Mr. Lark." He stepped forward, ignoring the chill in her tone. "I warned you that this would happen. I gave you every opportunity to preserve your good name, and yet you chose to defy reason and me." "I chose," she said sharply, "not to sell my dignity to a man who mistakes cruelty for care." For a brief instant, his composure cracked and his smile turned brittle. "Be careful, Miss Moore. Words spoken in anger often carry farther than intended. The village already doubts your virtue. Do not confirm their suspicions." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "They can doubt what they wish. Truth does not change because small minds choose not to see it." Lark studied her for a moment, then sighed, shaking his head in mock pity. "So proud even now. But pride will not protect you when Lord Ravensmere is forced to abandon you." Her pulse quickened. "He would never—" He cut her off smoothly. "He will. The law and society will demand it. Do you think the magistrate will turn a blind eye to this? He has already received letters, anonymous of course, questioning the propriety of your meetings, the visits at night, the witness of Mrs. Pennington herself." Harriet's breath caught, her heart twisting painfully. "You wrote those letters." "I merely provided truth where others supplied rumor," he replied coolly. "And it will not be long before that truth reaches London. Once there, not even his title will protect him. A scandal of this kind attached to a widowed marquess will not be forgiven." Harriet took a slow step toward him, her voice trembling but defiant. "Leave my house." He tilted his head slightly. "You may still end this. Marry me, and the story dies with me. You would have respect again, safety, a name untarnished." She stared at him, incredulous. "You mistake me, Mr. Lark. I would rather live despised and forgotten than bound to you." His expression hardened. "Then you condemn yourself." "I free myself," she corrected, "and I free him from the lies you weave." Lark's jaw tightened. He replaced his hat, his tone cold. "We shall see how free you both remain when Ambleside turns its back." He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the sound of distant rain. When the door closed behind him, Harriet sank into the nearest chair, her strength finally faltering. The fireless hearth seemed to mock her resolve, the silence of the cottage pressing in like a weight. She did not weep. Her tears had long since dried into something sharper, more enduring, but deep within, fear stirred, whispering that perhaps this time love had come not to heal, but to destroy. Hours passed before another knock came, softer this time. hesitant. Her heart knew who it was before she even opened the door. James stood there, pale from sleeplessness, his eyes shadowed by worry. His presence, once a balm, now carried with it the ache of inevitability. "Harriet," he said quietly, stepping inside. "I was told Lark came to you." She nodded. "He means to ruin us both." "I know," he said, "and I fear he has already begun." He placed a letter on the table, its seal broken. "The magistrate summoned me this morning. There are accusations, formal ones, impropriety, coercion, deceit. He claims I used my influence to compromise you." Her face paled. "That is monstrous." "It is," he said softly, "but it is also effective. The magistrate will not dismiss it. There will be an inquiry." Harriet's voice trembled. "An inquiry means humiliation. It means the end of your standing, of everything." He looked at her, his expression calm but filled with pain. "What does standing mean when one has already lost peace?" "James," he took her hands gently, "do you regret this? Tell me honestly, Harriet. If I had not come into your life, would you be safe now?" Her eyes filled with tears she could no longer contain. "Perhaps safer," she whispered, "but never alive." He exhaled shakily, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "Then I will face whatever comes." The tenderness in his touch nearly undid her. "You cannot fight them all," she said through tears. "They will not stop until one of us is destroyed." "Then let it be me," he said simply. "No," she whispered fiercely, "do not speak like that." "I mean it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "They cannot take from me what I have already given to you." She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "And what is that?" He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "My heart." The words silenced her. For a long, trembling moment, they stood with only the sound of rain between them. Then, without thinking, Harriet reached up and touched his face. The gesture was simple, yet filled with all the longing that words could not hold. "You must not come here again," she said softly, "not until this ends." He caught her hand against his cheek, refusing to let it fall. "And if it never ends? Then I will bear the blame," she whispered. "But you must not suffer for me." His eyes darkened with sorrow. "You ask the impossible. Then do the impossible," she said. "Live, even if it means living without me." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he lowered her hand slowly and stepped back, his voice a broken whisper. "If that is your wish, I will honor it." "It is not my wish," she said, her voice trembling. "It is my punishment." He looked at her as though memorizing her face, every line and shadow. "Then may I be your punishment gladly," he murmured, and turned to leave before she could stop him. When the door closed behind him, Harriet pressed her hand to her heart as though to steady it, but nothing could steady it now. The next morning dawned clear, cruelly bright. The rain washed away, but leaving behind a silence too sharp to bear. Word spread quickly that Lord Ravensmere had gone to the magistrate's house, not to deny the charges, but to defend her name. By noon, half the village had gathered in the square, their curiosity veiled as moral concern. Harriet remained at her cottage, pacing like a prisoner. Each passing hour stretched unbearably. Finally, as dusk approached, there came a sound of carriage wheels on the road, a slow, deliberate approach. She ran to the window, her breath catching as she saw him step down from the carriage, his coat dark against the pale sky. He entered without waiting for her to speak. "It is done," he said quietly. She searched his face, desperate. "What have you done?" "I told them the truth," he said, "that you are innocent, that I alone bear the blame for what they call scandal." Her knees nearly gave way. "You did what?" He took her hand, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "If they must condemn someone, let it be me. They cannot destroy both of us." "James, no," she began, but he silenced her with a look, gentle yet unyielding. "It is too late," he said. "The matter is settled. They will leave you in peace." "At what cost?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What have you sacrificed?" He smiled faintly. Only what was never mine to keep, my reputation, my pride, the illusion of belonging among men I have long despised." She shook her head in disbelief, tears spilling freely. "You have ruined yourself for me." "For love," he corrected softly. "Not ruin." Her tears fell harder. "How can you say that?" "Because," he said, his voice breaking for the first time in years, "I have done something worth losing everything for." She pressed her forehead against his chest, her sobs muffled by the steady rhythm of his heart. "What will become of you?" He rested his hand on her hair, his tone quiet, resolute. "Whatever must. But know this. No matter what they say, no matter where I stand, you have been my redemption." Outside, the first snow began to fall. Soft, tentative flakes drifting through the quiet dusk. Harriet lifted her face to his, her tears glistening in the dim light. "I cannot let you bear this alone," she whispered. "You already have," he said gently. "Your courage has carried me farther than pride ever could." The snow thickened, the evening fading into white silence. He kissed her hand, just once, reverently, as though sealing a vow. When he stepped back toward the door, she caught his sleeve, her voice trembling. "James, whatever comes, promise me you will not vanish into silence again." He met her gaze, his eyes soft and sorrowful. "I promise nothing," he said, "except that my heart will always return to you, even if I cannot." Then he was gone, his figure fading into the falling snow, leaving behind only the echo of his voice and the warmth of a love that had defied every storm. Harriet stood in the doorway long after he disappeared, the snow melting on her lashes, the world hushed and hollow around her. And though her heart ached with fear, somewhere within that ache burned a fragile, unyielding truth. Love, once spoken, could never again be silenced. The snow came softly at first, as if the sky itself were hesitant to disturb the world below. It fell over Ambleside in a hush that felt sacred, covering the roofs and lanes in pale silence. Harriet Moore stood at her window with her hands pressed to the cold glass, watching the village blur into white. A few days had passed since James Blackwood walked away into that snowfall, leaving behind a vow that was not quite a promise, and a sacrifice that did not feel like salvation. He had said the magistrate would leave her in peace, and in a way, Ambleside had done what small places always did. It accepted the version of truth that cost it the least discomfort. People began to nod at Harriet again, slowly, carefully, as if testing whether she could be allowed back into their narrow world. The butcher offered her the better cut without comment. The baker's wife spoke of the weather as though nothing had happened. Mrs. Pennington still smiled, of course, but her smile had sharpened, now pleased with itself for surviving scandal without being stained by it. Harriet endured those courtesies as if they were a new kind of punishment. Every polite nod reminded her of what had been paid to purchase it. Ravensmere, however, did not appear among the village streets anymore. The absence of his carriage on the road, the absence of his dark figure at the church's back pew, the absence of the steady gaze that had become the one truthful thing in her days, those absences haunted Harriet more than any whisper had. There were hours when she could not breathe without feeling the ache of him. Then came the letter. It arrived one morning in an envelope sealed with black wax, delivered by a boy who would not meet her eyes. Harriet took it with fingers that trembled, and the tremble did not stop until she had broken the seal. The handwriting inside was James's, measured, controlled, as though each word had been pressed into place by sheer will. "Miss Moore, I have done what I believed would spare you. I did not do it to abandon you. I did it because I could not bear to see you ruined for the crime of being seen. They will speak of me now as they once spoke of her. Let them. Their cruelty has always needed a vessel. I must leave Ambleside for a time, not because my heart has fled, but because the world will not allow it to remain openly beside yours. If you ever believed me capable of courage, know that this is the only kind I have left, endurance. James." Harriet read the letter twice, then a third time, until the words began to blur with tears she refused to let fall. He had left. He had truly left. And yet he had not truly gone, not in the way that mattered. He had written to her as if she were still something sacred, as if he still belonged to her in the only way he had ever dared, in truth. But endurance was not love's final form. Love, Harriet realized, could not be fed on distance forever. That night, she walked to the lake. Snow had settled thickly along the path, muffling her steps, and the water beyond was dark and still, the surface broken only by the soft fall of flakes. She wrapped her cloak tighter and stared into that quiet, thinking of the nights when he had stood beside her in silence, thinking of the way his voice had sounded when he said her name as though it were a prayer. She whispered into the cold, as if the night might carry it to him. "I will not let you disappear into sacrifice." Her breath rose in a white cloud and vanished. The next day, she went to the rectory. Mrs. Pennington received her with the same bright authority, the same practiced charm that made gossip feel like charity. She offered tea, she offered a chair, she offered the kind of kindness that always asks something in return. Harriet did not sit. "I need the truth," Harriet said, her voice calm, her spine straight. "Not the village's truth, the real one." Mrs. Pennington blinked, offended. "My dear Miss Moore, what truth could you possibly mean?" Harriet watched her closely, the way one watches a door that might open to reveal everything behind it. "The letters," Harriet said softly. "The ones sent to the magistrate, the ones that began the inquiry. I know Mr. Lark threatened me. I know he orchestrated much of what happened. But I also know he did not act alone." For the first time, the rector's wife's smile wavered. "You have no proof," she said quickly. Harriet leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I do not need proof to recognize fear. You were there by the lake the day you found us. You were always there when rumors were born. You are the kind of woman who believes she can steer morality like a carriage." Mrs. Pennington's cheeks flushed. "How dare you speak to me in such a tone?" "How dare you," Harriet replied, equally quiet, "pretend you are innocent while a man was driven away from his own home?" The room fell into a silence so sharp it felt like glass. Then the rector's wife set down her teacup with a soft clink that sounded like surrender. "It was not only for you," she said at last, her voice thin. "It was for the parish." Harriet's heart tightened. "Do not disguise cruelty as duty." Mrs. Pennington lifted her chin defensively. "Lord Ravensmere is troubled. He always has been. His late wife's death was an illness," Harriet said firmly. "And yet you all speak as if grief were evidence of crime." Mrs. Pennington's eyes flickered, revealing something else beneath her certainty. Guilt, perhaps, or something like it. "There were letters," she admitted quietly, "from the late Marchioness. Years ago. She wrote to a friend in Kendal. She wrote of loneliness, of fear, of misunderstandings within the house. And when she died, those letters became dangerous." Harriet's breath caught. "Dangerous to whom?" "To the title," Mrs. Pennington whispered, as if the word itself were holy. "To the estate, to the reputation. People like Mr. Lark believe a title is a ladder. People like me believe it is a wall, and walls must be protected." Harriet's hands clenched at her sides. "So you hid them?" "I did not hide them," Mrs. Pennington said quickly. "I was asked to keep them. The rector received them, and he believed it would spare the family shame. We never imagined—" Harriet's voice turned icy. "You imagined plenty. You imagined scandal when it suited you. You imagined virtue when it kept you safe." The older woman's face hardened. "You do not understand what it means to keep a parish standing." Harriet took a slow breath, forcing her fury into clarity. "I understand what it means to keep your conscience asleep." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Tell the rector," Harriet said, "that I will see those letters. If he refuses, I will go to Kendal myself. I will go to every person your late Marchioness ever confided in, until the truth is no longer yours to lock away." Mrs. Pennington's voice chased her like a desperate hand. "Miss Moore, you will only bring more shame." Harriet did not look back. "Then let shame finally belong to those who earned it." 2 days later, the rector, pale, trembling and suddenly older, came to Harriet's cottage with a small packet wrapped in cloth. He could not meet her eyes. "I did what I thought was right," he said, voice thick with regret. "The Marchioness was unwell in mind as well as body. She wrote things in despair. We feared the village would turn her into a spectacle. And instead," Harriet said softly, "you turned her husband into one." The rector swallowed. "Mr. Lark asked questions. He offered to help us manage matters if we allowed him to see certain papers. We did not realize—" "You did," Harriet said, not cruelly, but truthfully. "You realized enough. You simply chose convenience." Her hands shook as she took the packet. She untied it carefully, as if touching something sacred. Inside were letters, their paper yellowed with time, their ink faded but still legible. Harriet read them alone that night by the fire. They were not a confession of murder, not a scandalous secret of violence. They were something worse for those who lived on appearances, a portrait of misery, of isolation, of a household that had whispered behind closed doors. The late Marchioness wrote of her sickness, yes, but also of Mr. Lark's early involvement with estate papers through a notary in Kendal. She wrote of a man who seemed too eager to assist with legal arrangements. She wrote of pressure, subtle, persistent, around her correspondence, her visitors, her freedom. She wrote one line that made Harriet's blood run cold. "He speaks of my husband's grief as if it were an opportunity." Harriet's hands tightened around that page. It was enough. Not to convict in court, perhaps, but enough to shift the story. Enough to expose Lark's hunger and the parish's cowardice. Enough to clear the shadow that had clung to James. And if the world demanded proof dressed as spectacle, Harriet would give it what it wanted, without surrendering the dignity of the dead. The next Sunday, Ambleside gathered for service under a sky the colour of pewter. The church was full, every pew occupied, the air thick with curiosity disguised as reverence. Harriet walked down the aisle alone, her footsteps steady, her posture unbending. She could feel the village watching her like a single creature with many eyes. At the front sat Edwin Lark, his expression composed, almost confident, as though he expected the world to reward him for the role he had played. Harriet took her seat and waited. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to rise, she stood. Her voice carried through the church before anyone could stop her. "Rector," she said, calm as winter, "before the people leave, I ask permission to speak." A ripple moved through the pews. The rector's hands tightened on the pulpit. His gaze flickered with fear, but perhaps something in Harriet's face, something fierce and unswayed, forced him to nod. "You may," he said hoarsely. Harriet stepped forward into the aisle, the packet of letters held in her gloved hands like a quiet weapon. "I have been spoken of," she said, her voice steady, each word measured. "And so has Lord Ravensmere. The village has made a sport of our names. It has called my character into question and made a legend of his grief." Murmurs rose. Mrs. Pennington's face tightened like a drawn ribbon. Harriet continued, "I will not defend myself with tears. I will defend truth with truth." She lifted the letters. These were written by the late Marchioness of Ravensmere. They were kept hidden under the guise of protection. But protection has been used here not for mercy, but for control. Edwin Lark's eyes narrowed. Harriet turned slightly, letting her gaze settle on him without flinching. "Mr. Lark has presented himself as a saviour. He has offered marriage as if a woman's dignity were a coin he could purchase, and he has stirred the village's fear to make himself look noble." Lark rose slowly, the smile gone. "This is inappropriate." "It is truth," Harriet cut in, her voice still calm. "And you, sir, have always feared truth more than scandal." The rector swallowed visibly. Harriet did not need to read every letter aloud. She selected one line, only one, short enough to be merciful, sharp enough to be undeniable. He speaks of my husband's grief as if it were an opportunity. Silence fell so completely that even the candles seemed to hold their breath. Locke's face paled, then hardened. Those are the ramblings of a dying woman. Harriet's gaze did not waver. No, they are the words of a woman who saw predators among polite faces. A stir moved through the church, uneasy and shifting. People glanced at one another, their confidence weakening. The story they had enjoyed was changing shape, and change frightened them more than cruelty ever had. The rector's voice broke. "Mr. Lark, did you request access to estate papers through the Kendall notary?" Lark's jaw clenched. "I am a solicitor. I conduct business." "And did you," Harriet asked softly, "send letters to the magistrate with anonymous accusations to force a public inquiry?" Lark's silence was brief, but it was enough. Mrs. Pennington rose, her voice sharp. "This is madness. You cannot accuse—" "I can," Harriet said quietly, turning her gaze upon the woman. "Because you helped him. You fed the rumor and called it morality." Mrs. Pennington's mouth opened, but no words came that did not sound like confession. In the midst of that heavy silence, a sound came from the back of the church. Slow, deliberate footsteps on stone. The congregation turned as one. James Blackwood stood at the entrance, his dark coat dusted with snow, his face pale but composed, his eyes steady. He looked like a man who had walked through ruin and returned with nothing left to fear. Harriet's breath caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. He walked down the aisle without haste, without apology. When he reached her, he did not touch her, not yet. But his presence beside her was more intimate than any embrace. His voice, when it came, was low and clear. "I was told," he said, looking at the rector, then at the villagers, "that my name was spoken again in my absence." A tremor ran through the pews. No one dared respond. James turned to Harriet, his gaze softening. "You should not have had to do this alone." Harriet's voice trembled. "You should not have had to leave." His eyes held hers, and the silence between them was full of everything they had endured. "I did not leave," he murmured. "I endured." Then he faced the room. "I will not allow you to destroy her to amuse yourselves. I will not allow you to use my grief as entertainment. If you require a villain, choose the one who manufactured this scandal for profit." He looked at Lark. Edwin Lark's composure finally fractured. "My lord, this is absurd." James's tone sharpened like winter air. "You came to her door in a storm. You pressed her with marriage as if she were property. You sent accusations to the magistrate and hid behind anonymity. And you believed I would remain silent because silence has always been my cage." He stepped forward one pace. "It will not be any more." The rector's hands shook. "Mr. Lark," he said, voice strained, "until the magistrate reviews these letters and the testimony of those involved, you are to cease all engagement with parish matters. Leave." Lark's face contorted with fury, humiliation burning through him. His gaze snapped to Harriet, then to James. "You think this ends here," he hissed. "You think a village will embrace what it cannot control." James's reply was quiet and lethal. "It does not need to embrace it. It needs only to stop pretending it owns it." Lark stormed out of the church, his boots striking stone like a retreating drumbeat. Silence remained, thick and trembling. People shifted, uncertain what to do now that the story had changed. Shame, real shame, had entered the room at last. Harriet turned to James. Her voice was barely audible. "You came back." His expression softened into something like relief. "I followed your courage." Her eyes shimmered. "And what happens now?" James looked at her as though the answer had always been written in him. Slowly, with a tenderness that did not ask permission, he reached for her hand. His glove brushed her fingers, then his hand enclosed hers with quiet certainty. "Now," he said softly, "I stop standing by the walls." Outside, the snow continued to fall, turning the village into a world of softened edges and second chances. Harriet's breath shook as she squeezed his hand. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were honest. The magistrate demanded testimony. The rector confessed his concealment. Mrs. Pennington's influence weakened under the weight of public embarrassment. Edwin Lark, exposed as a manipulator, found his invitations withdrawn, his smiles no longer welcomed. The story shifted again, this time toward truth. Ravensmere Hall opened its doors not with arrogance, but with purpose. James hosted a small gathering, not to display power, but to reclaim the life he had been denied. Invitations were extended carefully, and those who came did so with a new awareness. The old rules still existed, but their cruelty had been named. On the night of the spring assembly, the chandeliers glowed again, the violins sang again, and the great room filled with candlelight and quiet expectation. Harriet entered in a gown of soft ivory, her hair pinned low, a small silver comb catching the light. She did not look like a woman pleading for acceptance. She looked like a woman who had survived judgment and refused to be diminished by it. James waited not by the wall, not in shadow. He stood at the center of the room. When Harriet's eyes found him, his expression softened with a devotion so steady it made her breath catch. He crossed the room without hesitation, every step a declaration. He stopped before her and offered his hand, palm open, unguarded. "May I have this dance?" he asked. The room seemed to hold its breath. Harriet felt the weight of every gaze, every old rule, every fear that had tried to shape her into silence. Then she smiled, small, radiant, unmistakably real. "Yes," she whispered, "you may." His fingers closed around hers, warm even through the glove. As the music began, he drew her into the dance with a reverence that made the world fall away. Their steps were measured, elegant, perfectly restrained, and yet every movement carried intimacy. The way his hand hovered at her waist without pressing, the way her fingers rested lightly against his sleeve, the way their eyes held, steady and unashamed, as if they were speaking without words. They moved through the center of the room as though it belonged to them not by right of title, but by right of truth. "You once told me," Harriet murmured as they turned, "that you saw the world in shadows." James's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "And you were light." Her throat tightened. "And now?" He leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Now I see a life." The music swelled, the chandeliers shimmering above them. Around them the village watched, some with admiration, some with reluctant acceptance, some with envy. But none could deny what stood before them, a man who had stepped out of mourning, and a woman who had refused to be broken. When the dance ended, he did not release her hand at once. He held it one heartbeat longer, as if to remind her that this was real. "I have something for you," he said softly. He guided her toward a quieter corner near the windows that overlooked the lake. Outside, the water gleamed under moonlight, calm and endless. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Harriet's breath caught. "James!" He opened it to reveal a simple gold ring. No excessive stones, no flamboyant display, only a quiet promise, as honest as the man offering it. "I have nothing to offer you that is easy," he said, his voice steady but tender, "but I can offer you a name that will never silence you, a home that will never cage you, a life built not on fear, but on choice." Harriet's eyes filled with tears, but her smile held. "And what do you ask in return?" she whispered. "Your hand," he said, "and your truth, every day, for as long as we are given." Her voice broke, and she did not hide it. "You already have it." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that did not tremble anymore. When he lifted his gaze to hers, the emotion there was so raw and reverent that Harriet felt her heart ache with gratitude. "You see me," she whispered. "I have always seen you," he replied, "but now I will stand where everyone can." He bowed his head slightly, his forehead nearly touching hers, and though they did not kiss, the closeness between them was more intimate than any public embrace could have been. It was devotion made visible, Outside, the lake reflected the moon like a promise kept. Inside, the music began again, and James Blackwood, once the widowed Marquis who stood by the walls, led Harriet Moore back into the light, into the center of the room, where love was no longer a secret, but a triumph. Some love stories end with a kiss. This one ends with a choice. Because Harriet and James didn't win by being flawless, wealthy, or untouched by pain. They won by refusing to let fear write their future. They were judged, cornered, misunderstood, and still they chose truth over comfort, courage over reputation, and a love that demanded honesty instead of perfection. If there's a lesson that lingers long after the last dance, it's this. The world will always have opinions, but it doesn't get to own your heart. People can whisper, assume, and condemn, yet they cannot silence the life you build when you finally stop living for approval. Harriet didn't become strong because life was gentle. She became strong because she decided she deserved more than survival. And James didn't stop standing by the walls because the world suddenly became kinder. He stepped forward because love reminded him he was still alive. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been punished for being true, if you've ever hesitated at the edge of your own happiness, let this story be a quiet reminder. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to begin again. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to step into the center of the room, even when your knees are shaking. Now tell me, what did this story awaken in you? Did you feel Harriet's courage? Did James's devotion move you? I'd truly love to read your thoughts, because your comments keep these stories alive and help this community grow. And if you made it all the way to the end, type the word mist in the comments, because it was in the mist that whispers tried to break them. And it was through the mist that they found each other anyway. I'll be looking for that word so I know who stayed until the final heartbeat of this romance. If you'd like to support the team that makes these stories possible, you can send a super thanks on YouTube in any amount you can or want. Truly, every gesture helps us keep bringing you new historical romances with the depth and emotion you deserve. And if that's not possible, please know that sharing this story with someone you love, your sister, your friend, your mother, anyone who adores a sweeping period romance, is a beautiful way to help too. And before you go, don't forget, I'm leaving more stories like this waiting for you in the cards. More longing, more secrets, more love that refuses to stay hidden. Choose one and let another romance carry you away.